Georgi, great to have you here.
Wonderful to be here.
There's a lot going on around us politically or geopolitically, and I wanted to approach things from a very sociological point of view, which is your world. So I'm going to sort of make a tour of our country and the neighboring countries, and I want you to use your sociological insights to tell us what is going on beneath the surface level of the politics that we see, because politics tends to be very surface level. Obviously, we're going to start with Armenia, and most of our focus will be here. It's going to be a long-winded question. What has been the impact of the last 5 years, specifically the defeat, the ethnic cleansing, and even the events of the last 24, 36 hours in shaping where are we at as a society? Because from a critical point of view, you can say that we're a sort of a humiliated society that's willing to put up with things that it wouldn't have put up with many years ago. So my question is, where does that really come from? Does that come from being thoroughly defeated? Does that come from being betrayed by a political class for the last 30 years? Or is this lack of engagement or anger, if you want to call it, a result of the affluence or becoming more of a consumer society? Where do you see this at?
The answer is all of the above, as in a good freshman student answer to a test. But let me first explain when you said sociology, what kind of sociology I do, because usually, especially in this part of the world, people automatically think about survey analysis and ask me, so what is your polling shows? I don't do polling. I do very old-fashioned sociology in a rather classical manner of Max Weber, Charles Tilly, Immanuel Wallerstein, asking comparative historical question. I will give you just a couple examples. Classic question is why Poland is not Holland. They're both white countries, both European. So when you are speaking about the Western experience, do you mean Portugal, Norway, Ireland? Which one? For instance, Poland is right next to Czech Republic. They are both brotherly Western Slavic people. Their food, drink, pork sausage, beer is the same. One of them is a heroic Polish nation. Their national heroes are Pan Władysław, the swordsman from the 17th century fighting the Turks. The national hero of Czech people is brave soldier Švejk. One country is the most religious in Europe, and the other is the least religious. Why is that? And sometimes countries which are quite similar take different routes on something relatively small. This is what we are looking for. What is that switch? For instance, in the early 1930s, the Great Depression is blamed for bringing Hitler and the Nazis to power in Germany. But if you study Scandinavia, the same Great Depression is blamed for bringing social democracy in Scandinavia, which is even more Nordic country than Germany. Right, so who would be more Aryan, if you wish, the blonder people up in the north, but instead it's social state, it's the economics of Gunnar Myrdal, and so forth. So how do you get Sweden and Denmark from the very same catastrophe which produces Nazism in Germany? So that's what I study. It's comparative historical. And this is where I began, still in the late Soviet period, asking the question that Soviet republics were 15 in number. They all had what we call isomorphous institutions, basically meaning that in Estonia, Uzbekistan, or Armenia, there would be district party committees. There was the party apparat, there was KGB everywhere, there were planning agencies, there were collective farms. However, obviously, a collective farm in Uzbekistan and in Estonia would be two very different matters. How did this happen? And we see this even more pronounced in the Caucasus. Now we don't know what even to call it. Transcaucasia? No, it's old name, because Transcaucasia means on the other side from Russia. So we call it South Caucasus. All right, is South Caucasus Europe? Is it Middle East, as some people say? Is it at all a meaningful unit to say that Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan are the same? Is there much to be shared? So this is what I study. And we see that they're divergent. They're going on very different directions. And at this point, I think it's irreversible. We are going to see them going further and further apart. And in this respect, yes, we're at a pivotal moment, because the post-Soviet transitions, what they called, the transitions started in 1989 with collapse of Soviet Union, are finally ending. And the social structures, the elites, the people who rule those social structures are being smashed all over, or they are, in Armenia, for instance, say, the oligarchs of the 1990s. The kind of people who used to be the new masters of the universe. On the other hand, in Azerbaijan, for instance, you see to the contrary, actually the trajectory in which Azerbaijan had been in Soviet times, a very corrupt, family-ruled fiefdom, essentially, under the guise of KGB and Communist Party control, lost that guise, but it is even more than ever corrupt and family-ruled fiefdom. Georgia had always been very lively. The other way of saying that is chaotic. Their politics is going from peaks of expecting some kind of a huge figure. This is the country which produced messiah-like figures. Well, Stalin was a Georgian. To mention, the Soviet Union was run at some point by Comrade Stalin, by his henchman Lavrenti Beria, and the head of MGB, General Gvishiani, so 3 Georgians, actually, speaking about the usual locutions. The Russians decided to deport the Chechen people to Central Asia. All 3 signatures on that deportation order, which was discovered in the archives, are by 3 ethnic Georgians, for instance. Anti-communist Georgians emerge openly during perestroika, and there is a huge messiah-like expectation of Zviad Gamsahurdia coming, extreme nationalist, son of the greatest Georgian, he was really greatest Georgian modern novelist, himself a Shakespearean scholar, extremely well educated, well bred, as you would say. Within months, they would call him GOAT and demand that he should go. So then returns the former Soviet leader Shevardnadze, and he's like savior of the nation. It took him a couple years before they want him out. There are assassination attempts, there are protests against Shevardnadze, and finally he is overthrown in a revolution where a young American educated lawyer, Mikhail Saakashvili, is coming like a new messiah. Misha is on his way out several years later, and he's now in prison. So Bidzina Ivanishvili comes, a mysterious billionaire who left Georgia as a very simple village boy, went to Russia and returned with billions of dollars somehow. At first, great patron of arts and artists, and then the man who doesn't even have any state rank. So there is an awkward question when President Macron of France calls him. Why does he call a common Georgian citizen? And not president. There is a nominal president.
A football player.
I would have difficulty even remembering the name.
Yeah.
So in Armenia, we see something quite different happening. So this is what I would really like to discuss with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go through it.
Armenians were extraordinarily adapted to make careers in the Russian Empire and later in the Soviet Union. Let me just mention, Loris Melikov, who was prime minister under the Tsar Alexander II, already in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Anastas Mikoyan, for instance. And somehow Armenians kind of grabbed the opportunity to climb this ladder of success, and that's why we have such a great diaspora, if you wish, across former Soviet republics. So all those Armenians who are very successful in all walks of life, not just in trade, in science, in arts, in engineering, across former Soviet Union, and now quite globally. You find Armenians in China. You go almost anywhere around the world, and yes, so there are Armenians shining all over the place. Georgia took a different route because more protected, more blessed country, if you wish, better climate, more protected by their mountain peaks and valleys, fertile, and they preserved their feudal elite from the early medieval period. In 1917, 7% of Georgian population claimed nobility. Just can you imagine how many peasants does it take to adequately maintain a lord at his level of consumption, which means that this will be very poor nobles in general. For comparison, in England, 0.5%, 0.5% of population were lords. In France, Ancien Régime France, before the revolution, 1.5% perhaps, Georgia 7%, Poland 10%. Tells you why Georgia is Poland in the Caucasus. This produces also very impressive intelligentsia, because these are cultured people. So the people who could afford their grandmothers, mothers, aunts, they afforded great education, and they did produce a lot of cultural achievements. It's admirable, and in cultural achievements I would include not only Georgian films and novels, but also Georgian food and wines. So these are substantial achievements. They are very important contributions to world civilization. Azerbaijan, by contrast, an area which didn't have the name for a very long time, which many Azerbaijanis take as an insult, but it just happens. People lived in different political units. They were called Khanates. In Kuba, in Karabakh, in Baku, they were of rather different religious persuasions. But what is mostly important is that those were kind of Oriental Persian Empire outskirts, Oriental, quite controlled societies. Controlled in the sense that we all hear about the tremendous resistance of the Caucasus peoples to the Russian conquest in the 19th century. The Ghazavat of Imam Shamil in the Caucasus. There was nothing of the sort in what becomes Azerbaijan. They just submitted, they were conquered in 2 wars by Russian Empire. By 1829, the border was drawn along the river, dividing, this Azerbaijan from their brethren in Persian Azerbaijan, and that becomes forever. That country, however, was very centralized around the city of Baku. Because Baku must be, this is something which, again, you have to be reminded. Everybody knows, that Azerbaijan is an oil-producing country. But do you realize that in the 19th century, it produced actually more oil in the 1870s than Standard Oil Corporation of John D. Rockefeller?
That was the #1 oil producer in the world.
They were #1
Yeah.
at some point. And who are they? They're mostly the Nobel brothers. That Nobel
From
Prize
Sweden, yeah.
contains some of Baku oil money, because there were 3 brothers. Alfred, who invented dynamite, never left Sweden. He stayed in Sweden, so it's Swedish price. But his brothers actually created, that industry with great innovation. It's a very interesting story what was happening there, and this created a very dynamic and very ugly city. How ugly? How Chicago was ugly in the late 19th century, industrial, grimy, and this is why very dangerous. And this is why also such a hotbed of revolutionary activities. This is why people like Stalin, people, I can go on and on naming great Russian revolutionaries. You'd be surprised actually how many of them had started their careers in Baku. Stalin spent 20 years fighting against the injustice of Tsarist regime, and he was hoping, that he was bringing a new, very different kind of life, which would be even more unjust, but would be very different from Stalin's regime, from Tsarist regime. Stalin in 1921 visits Tiflis in July 1921. He spoke to a full audience at the Opera House on Rustaveli Prospect. But this is the moment when he is asked to help with deciding on the smaller territories in the Caucasus. His first reaction was, to hell with all these republics, abolish them, make them part of Russian Federation. That's why his position was called federalist. Dependencies of Russia, federal republics like Tatarstan within Russia. Lenin said no, and Stalin, being a true Leninist, followed the orders, and he created Georgian, Azerbaijani, and Armenian republics. The question was, what about places like Karabakh? And the first reaction, it looks like, so these archives have been opened in the early 1990s, and now they're closed again. We don't know for how long, somewhere in Moscow. There were, from what I hear from the researchers who had the luck to discover these documents in the archives in Moscow, tell me, that the argument was quite simple. Population of Karabakh is Armenian, first argument. Armenia is just next door to it. Let's join them together. And done deal. To which Georgian comrades object and call Lenin, say that, what are you doing? Adjaria, the capital of which is Batumi, then is seceding to Turkey automatically, because if we allow those who want to be in their brethren motherland republic join their mainland, then Batumi, which had the population of ethnic Georgians who get converted to Sunni Islam, they might have seceded to Turkey, and of course Turkish Republic would gladly welcome them, because Batum was probably the second most important oil port in the world. So, okay, plan B, very communist as well. What causes problems among the nationalities? Backwardness. What is the best way of, and of course, imperialist intervention? So we drove away the Entente forces, the British, the French, Ottoman Turks, they're all out. Now it's all within the Soviet realms. We have our guards at the border, and what remains is to bring a lot of development, as they call it. Development, industrial development, schools, healthcare, to places like Karabakh, to provide jobs for the people. Who would do this better, Baku or Yerevan? There was not even a question. Obviously, in Baku there probably were more ethnic Armenians than in Yerevan at the time. Anyway, and of course there would be much more opportunity for Armenians to make careers in Baku. So this is how Karabakh becomes part of Azerbaijan, in my opinion. It was not a nefarious plan. It was not an anti-Armenian action per se. It was not a concession to the Turks as such. It was, in fact, it was a way of denying the most valuable concession to the Turks, denying Batumi. And in Karabakh, I continued this conversation asking local people, do you remember how the first Azerbaijanis appeared? When was that? The first Azerbaijanis appeared in your village. And of course, first you would hear, people went through the war. People have been reading newspapers, of course, hearing radio. They have been attending rallies. So they would all say that long-suffering Armenian people, look at that, we were 92% in the beginning of Soviet power, and then, we dropped to 78%. How could this be? Baku was conducting, ethnic cleansing here. Then the question would be, do you remember who was the first? They say, in the 60s, old couple, Armenian couple, died, babushka and dedushka, a granny, and their grandchildren by that time lived in Baku or in Moscow. They came for the funerals, and they wanted to sell the property. They were not going to live in the village. There were no buyers for the property. There was only one buyer from the neighboring Azerbaijani village, and that guy was an almost illiterate shepherd, relatively young, and the Armenian chairman of collective farm was actually glad. He probed them, please sell to him, at least get some money, 400 rubles, get out, because I need a shepherd in the collective farm. But that shepherd had 7 children. And when somebody else dies in the village, his brother moves in, and eventually there would be an Azerbaijani teacher in their school. There would be Armenian classes, there would be Azerbaijani classes in the same school. And then somebody will say, but tell me, why did they send us Azeri as medical doctor? To which my friend, Armenian, very good Armenian astrophysicist, who was helping you translate, Vahan Galoyan, laughed and said, can you imagine an Armenian child from a good Baku family accepting a job in your village in the mountains? So this was some C- Azeri student, who was sent here. So this is what is sociology, what people know, but they don't notice it. Let me now translate it into sociological jargon. Azerbaijanis, because of the higher fertility rate at the time, they had more children, and because they were more rural, they were villagers, they had more children, they had horizontal migration. They were migrating into the areas which looked similar to where they have been before in other village, be it in Karabakh. Armenians had vertical migration because they would migrate to Baku, to Moscow, to Novosibirsk, to LA probably. And they would still maintain this attachment to Hadrut somewhere, but this attachment was deep there. And would they visit once in 10 years? Once in 25 years? So this is what I study. And we are at a very different situation now. That ethnic cleansing, the exchange of populations is finished. It's very much like how Greece became Greek. There were very few Greeks 150 years ago in the country called Greece. Majority of Greeks were in the country which is now called Turkey. How Bosniaks moved to, how Circassians moved to Turkey, and so forth. So this country got consolidated. How Egypt became Arab Egypt predominantly.
I want to move to the discussion of the church and the political fight that everyone has watched. In fact, it's become international news. I remember you saying something in our private conversations a couple of weeks ago, which was that the Armenian church actually never survived its contact with capitalism. And the reason I say that is because people think that the Armenian church was very suppressed during Soviet times, and that was true in different periods. But in the late Soviet period, the person who was leading the church, the Vahapar, was a saintly figure that is still remembered and beloved by everyone. Mm-hmm. While at a period when you've had complete religious freedom in this country, in many, the church has been essentially free to do whatever, preach whatever that is the mandate of the church. You have a situation in which the church leadership is far less popular than it's ever been. In fact, it's despised in many quarters, and it is seen fairly or unfairly as sort of a black hand reaction. What do you think of this fight, and what does this tell us really about? Is this simply a political struggle based on Russian interference or the next elections, or is this something deeper than that?
Both. In real social life, it's very difficult to disentangle specific causes. Of course, political scientists and economists try to do exactly that because they must sample on one variable. It's usually very difficult to do calculations with several. I use words, and I will try to explain it simply. The Armenian church has, of course, this distinguished ancient history. There is actually in Russian on YouTube a wonderful lecture by distinguished linguist, academician Plungan. Plungan, of course, is not Armenian despite his name ending in Yan. He's a Moldovan. His family is from Moldova. So Plungan says the title of his talk is "Why Armenian Language is So Dear to Linguists." Because this is one of very few languages in the world which has a recorded history going, 1,600, maybe even longer. And we can actually see how the dialects emerge, what is happening, how dialects disappear. For instance, around Lake Sevan, one of my students, dialectologist, did research on the villagers here. And he comes back with his eyes wide open and said, Georgi Matveyevich, in one village, they have 3 dialects. They speak 3 different dialects. All 3 are Western Armenian because they're descendants of refugees. And husband and wife speak different dialects, which are disappearing. They are coming to more normative Armenian language. This is the legacy of genocide, which is also why Armenians, let me slightly step back, but say mention something very important, that unlike Georgians, who are divided historically into many nationalities in the world, they're divided into historical sub-ethnic groups. In Georgia, there are Emiratians, there are Kakhetians, there are Svan, who speak a language as removed as probably Norwegian from English, but they're all kind of nominally Georgian. In Central Asia, you often have tribal affiliation or different dialects, so they form some kind of corruption networks. In Chechnya, it's all very pronounced. Nothing of the sort in Armenia. Did you notice? You didn't notice, because it doesn't exist. It could have existed, but Armenians are Armenian. The role of the church has been huge in this, and there is a sort of luck, historical luck. That church became neither Catholic, the famous question, what kind of church is that? Is it Catholic or Orthodox?
Neither.
It's neither, because it emerged long before the schism between Catholics, Roman Catholics and Byzantine Orthodox, and it emerged in the geopolitical very active zone in the cracks between the Sasanian Persian Empire, which was back then Zoroastrian Empire, still flame worshipping, and Roman Empire rapidly becoming Christian at that time. So Christianity, but not of the Roman or Greek type. Your own Christianity. That's why your own alphabet, your own autonomy, and what is very important with monasteries. By the way, of course, we have this very rich tradition of manuscripts. But have you ever seen the manuscript of David Sasunsi David epic? Do you realize that this epic was never even mentioned in any church documents? So if not for some shepherds who related it in the 19th century, late 19th century, to curious Armenian folklorists, and then the Soviet scholars, who put it together with great effort because they were going in all sorts of directions. There is no common plot in Sasunsi David. They put it together in the 1930s because there has to be something publishable as a national epic. That there was a richer culture about which we know less because it was not a written culture. Sasunsi David survived by chance, survived among common peasants. It just shows to you that the church penetration into the common people was never really as deep as we assume. Today,
you sort of see it. You see that today with the people are expecting, hundreds or thousands of people to show up to defend the church, and it's just the clergy that show up for the most part. There's the population is not.
Which is interesting, which is back to the Czechs and Poles. So why is that? But at the same time, no. Of course, Armenian Church. Of course, our dear alphabet. Of course, we have the criminals who tattoo Armenian alphabet on their arms. So we have to be aware of the importance, but also of the problems that created. That church maintained a specific language and specific identity. So there was a nation before the nation, at least for those who could read the letters. And then this church helped to foster modern intelligentsia, which was pretty much like the discovery in the 19th century in Greece or in Ireland. New, young intellectuals, many of them of church origin, their parents might have been from the church origin. They look into the ancient documents, they start reading Latin and ancient Greek and realize that their ancestors were, wow, great. It's very much like the Irish, we are Celts, we are the Gaul, we are Greeks, we are Hellenes. Why are we under the Turks? What's happening with us? And we are such a historical nation, why nobody's helping us? So this explains also a lot about the structure of Armenian nationalism, which is very much like Irish nationalism, that there is a very strong Republican tendency and very difficult relationship with the church, because the church was always holding the nationalists.
So are you implying that the current conflict in a way is the birth pains of modernity, in the sense that a system that has served its purpose and for a stateless nation is losing its purpose in the context of a state?
No, the purpose remains. As a sociologist, I can tell you, that no religion is really disappearing around the world. That
no, not disappearing. Its role in government. I mean, its relevance in the society, or its political role.
The relevance was overtaken first by the Russian imperial government, and then Soviet Union, of course, not only repressed the church. Soviet Union created alternative institutions. However, there is something pretty unique about the Armenian church. Armenian church was tolerated to much greater degree than any other religious organization under the communists.
How much of this was the politicking of the church, of being able to navigate these troubled waters?
That was the politics of the diaspora, which was not anti-communist or anti-Soviet, which was kind of patriotic diaspora. It was what American military would call the force multiplier. So it would be actually good to have Armenian armed detachments in the Lebanon during the Civil War. So when the Soviet military needed to airlift in 1977 a few tanks to Ethiopia, they could refuel in Beirut, because Armenian kids with guns could secure the perimeter at the airport. Right, such thing. And the Soviets did something good back. And Armenians were very lucky that Catholicos was allowed to be elected, and a very decent man could be elected. Luck happens.
Beloved to today, actually.
And precisely because there was Soviet Union, many people would be surprised to hear this, but Soviet Union was much less corrupt than what came later.
I want to segue to something which has not been discussed. Last couple of days, there's been a lot discussed over the last few years about the Western pivot. Some people are for it, some are against it, some are strongly pro-Russian and oppose it. But there's one aspect of it that's been neglected, and that is the personality and the character of the man who's leading the country. And sometimes personality actually does matter. And I'm convinced that the Western pivot, whether it's good or bad, would not have happened if the country was being led not by if it was being led by someone who was actually not a provincial figure. The prime minister is not from the Yerevan elite. He does not get educated in Moscow. He doesn't have connections there. It would have been very difficult for a nice boy who grew up in the Yerevan elite, that went to Russian universities, dated Russian women, or half a dozen different things, to make this break, you almost have to be provincial and reckless and fearless in a way. Whether it's good or stupid, you don't know. It could be both. How do you think the character, this provincialism of the current prime minister, actually played a role in this pivot to the West that would not have been done otherwise?
Eric, here I would disagree, because I'm exhibit number one. I studied in Moscow. I dated Russian women. My mother is not Armenian. My grandmother was not Armenian. And here I am. So it's not just that. It's not just about acculturation. I think, that there is... Nikol Pashinyan has instincts and guts. That usually comes with provincials who are... I also... Quite often, people told me that I had guts and instincts. And, this is just, the survival techniques of those provincials, who are making it. So he made it through Yerevan hierarchy, which is probably also quite a hierarchy. But let me return, to the church, precisely because I suspect, this is a hypothesis, I don't know much about the prime minister and his upbringing, but being from a small town, he must remember small level or local level parish clergy. And parish clergy in a structure like Armenian church do most of it's very ungrateful situation, very unequal. They not only marry, they must marry. And if you get married, you cannot move to the higher ranks. This is the same situation as with Russian Greek Orthodox Church. You must be a monk to make a career in the church. And this was the way of manipulating the church promotions by KGB. And KGB was making a huge effort in the 1970s, in the 1960s and 70s to keep the church under control. Why? In the 1960s, Soviet ideology has all but vanished. It would be very difficult to find anybody who sincerely believed in communism. But people have to have faith. So let me tell you now that there are three levels of it. People must have faith. Everybody has faith. Faith, I have faith. I have faith in people, in goodness, in something very generic things. There are specific matters of faith organized as religion. Christian religion, Islam, and then there are the churches, the church hierarchies. So these are the generals and the arch-generals, the marshals, who organize it at the very top. But then there are all these, lieutenants at the sergeants at the local, deacons, parish priests, and as you realize, very much like an army depends so largely on sergeants. The capacity of any army to fight depends on NCOs. The church in Soviet times disregarded, that level, and it was probably because of KGB, and they saw that they were doomed not to make a career. There were other men making careers, and now imagine in the 1960s, 1970s, the first bad, and it is really very bad thing happening. A lot of people, including educated Soviet people, decided to become religious because they get disillusioned in this life around. Common people wanted to have a posh wedding at Sevanavank. They wanted rituals. Intelligentsia wanted something spiritual. They wanted to touch the manuscripts, to read Narekatsi. They wanted to reconnect with their culture. I interviewed, the people in Soviet times who were complaining that, I feel very bad that I don't speak such a village dialect as the cobbler at the street. I'm too educated. And then everything collapses. In the 1990s, KGB did not disappear. Look at Vladimir Putin. They became business. They became administration. They became the people creating their business opportunities, and church hierarchy, not the lower level of the church. But this is where I would like to have more data. I don't know what is the relationship between, what are the grievances. I'm sure there must be lots of grievances of parish priests.
It's appearances of corruption, for the most part.
Corruption was very much at the top. And this kind of corruption smashed the churches, not only in Armenia, everywhere, because who were the new masters of new life? Gangsters, gangster-like oligarchs, former KGB,
Gangster priests.
and these are the people who start donating to churches.
So what you're saying is that if you look at the prime minister's age, he would have been essentially in his most formative years. He is the guy who's looking at sort of the worst of society and the worst of corruption in the state and in the church. So his views are somewhat, could be formed by that, sort of the antagonism, but that's the part of the church. But but you don't see that, I mean, because in many ways it is recklessness. Armenia has been tied to Russian state systems for almost 200 years. And what the one thing that we do know about the last 48 hours, we don't know all the specifics, but the one thing that is very clear is Armenia joined Pax Americana. That's what that means is a completely different thing. If that's good or bad, it's a completely different thing. But I do not think that would have happened with another leader with another profile.
I am not so sure. I play this game of alternative history myself. It's fun. In 1917, there is no Lenin. What happens? Remove Stalin from something, or there was no Hitler. And every time I play this game seriously, I come to more or less the same result. No, it's mostly determined structurally, meaning that the situation, the conflict between church and state in Armenia repeats the pattern which was very typical of European countries in the late 19th century. I'm not speaking about Protestant reformations. This is not a rebellion from within the church. That actually already happened. You see how many Protestant sects are proselytizing and how successfully. All these Jehovah's Witnesses,
Mormons.
Mormons. So that already happened. Because the church doesn't cater to the social and spiritual needs and psychological needs of these people. How many funerals did we have during the war? How many priests we needed for the grieving families? Who did that work? On the other hand, once you introduce suffrage, and Armenia became, after 2018, a competitive democracy. You can say that the constitution is undemocratic. It's a great constitution designed for somebody else, inherited by Nikol Pashinyan, which of course helps him enormously. But the results of the coming elections are still unpredictable. This is at least the most basic test of democracy. You don't know who is going to win. And you know that there will have to be elections, otherwise it becomes unpredictable. Again, compare it to Azerbaijan, compare it to Russia, where everybody knows what will be the elections, how long Putin will stay in power. So once you spread suffrage to the common man in villages, you will have to spread it to the commoners, and the commoners would vote in their villages like the priest would tell them. French Republic in the 1870s, Gambetta, I can go on with lots of details on this. Bismarck in Germany, remember, I remind you, very quickly, if you don't know, just look in Wikipedia what was Kulturkampf, the culture struggle, the culture war of Bismarck. Bismarck fought against Catholic Church. Why there is Vatican, this ridiculous 4 square kilometer jurisdiction in the middle of Rome, issuing its postal stamps and presumably having its own army.
It's a big 20th century war in Italian history.
Yeah, because the Pope, when he saw Italian kingdom created by Garibaldi and Count Cavour around him, shut the doors and said that I'm not going to participate in any of that. And he stayed behind the closed door for the following 50 years. And he opened them to Mussolini in the 1920s only. And then they would have to go in a very difficult story of political aggiornamento of Catholic Church, which is still going on. See, every papal election, just how much of struggle there is for steering the church, making sure that even Catholic Church survives. So we are part of Europe. In this respect, the conflict which emerged here is very has very clear structural underpinnings that church, as it does exist, is structurally opposed to both Western pivot and this kind of political power.
Or democratization, or just kind of political
And
power?
democratization as well, because they feel best blessing the kind of people they have been blessing in the 1990s, in the early 2000s.
It's,
And so we are into a really post-Soviet transformation.
so you actually see this as something that is inevitable, one, and it's also, in its very strange way, a sign of progress.
This is, it all depends how you play it, how rough, but sometimes this is, we know from history, hey, look at King Henry VIII and what he did to his church and his wives. My favorite example is Sweden. Sweden is such a nice place, right? University of Uppsala. University of Uppsala is the seat, the holy see, actually, of Church of Sweden. Hey, it's a Protestant country. There must be Church of Sweden. I was thought about it. So royal palace, the castle, is on the slope right above the cathedral. The cathedral has beautiful stained glass windows, and there are cannons from the royal castle trained right into those windows. It's a joke, because the name of that rampart is called Sture Biskop. Sture is the Swedish word which in English becomes steering wheel. Steer the bishop. How about that? Sweden.
You talk about Henry VIII, so we're going to move to a somewhat modern version with Vladimir Putin. Let's move on to Russia. We learned over the last 24 hours that there's going to be a summit between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump in Alaska. Somehow, someday, this war will end. It either will end when a Ukrainian collapse, or something that is outlined in what Trump is outlining. It actually looks like a real Russian victory in many ways, just when you talk about from a military perspective. We have different scenarios. War ends now. What is outlined Russian victory, but obviously clear defeat in economic fields and half a dozen different things as far as the future projection of the country. Ukraine, it's harder to judge. You could have something where the war continues for a couple of more years, where it degrades both sides. What kind of a society, and more specifically, what kind of people, and I mean specifically the soldiers that are coming back, because the soldiers who come back from a war like this, for better or for ill, they tend to dominate the conversation and define politics because they have the credibility to do so for the next few decades. What comes out of this for Russian society after this war, regardless of the outcome?
Good that you ask me about the Russian society, because Ukrainian is going to be much more difficult, because Ukrainian army will be very bitter, but they are the heroes. They have quite clear number of heroes. They also have scoundrels, and they know who are the scoundrels. And this will be a political force which any future government of Ukraine, actually Europe, would have difficulty handling. In Russia, precisely because Vladimir Putin has been taking huge and brutal precautions to prevent the emergence of popular generals. In this respect, I usually compare Azerbaijan to Russia. These are two oil monarchies, or de facto despotisms. And the most important part is to prevent
Rivals
to have a big army, but no big
heroes.
Commanders. Look at Ilham Aliyev. Look at just the iconography. It's like, the war in Karabakh was won by Ilham and his daughters. It's more or less, it's not as graphic in Russia, but there are common soldiers. And many of those common soldiers were eaten after being decorated, are sent back to the battlefront and killed. So we're not quite sure how many of them would survive. So this war in Russia is doing a lot of social triage. It is sending part of society, the men in their 30s and early 40s, lower education, more provincial, who are taking this as a kind of heroic job. The great success of Russian propaganda is neo-religious. They managed to present this war as the continuation of war against the Germans. And when German tanks appear on the Ukrainian side, Leopards, something, there could be no bigger confirmation for Moscow. So that works up to a point, but remember, there are all those Russians who are now in Armenia. There are 1 million Russians abroad.
The country, yeah.
And these are just those young, educated Russians who could leave the country.
Best and brightest.
Best and brightest, entrepreneurial. The conflict will be very clear after the war in Russia. The veterans will be demanding veteran benefits, or their families will be demanding veteran benefits. They will be demanding money for nothing, or for having shed that blood. They're not going to become entrepreneurs. They're not going to become active bureaucrats.
So they're going to become rent seekers. Rent seekers from an oil state, essentially.
Exactly. And there is a cadre, second and third tier cadre of Russian bureaucrats. Russia is a country which does have an organized bureaucracy. And that organized bureaucracy lives in the fear which they can barely conceal. They do a great job, but notice it. Like, very simple question. Can you even name the man who, according to Russian constitution, must step in if something happens to Putin? It's prime minister of Russia. Who is the prime minister of Russia? But there is, and by the way, he's half Armenian, as it is rumored by evil tongues. Some of the most kind of outstanding Russian technocrats are somewhere in, not in the dark, but they're silent. So there is something very interesting, quite a few people in the Russian hierarchy were allowed or somehow managed to stay silent. Very important mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin, barely said anything ever about this war. Right? There are all these Russian, pretty modern corporations. In Abu Dhabi or in Dubai, I'm now calling a taxi. I'm using the Russian Yandex. So there are successful businesses, and there are successful universities. What about Vyshka, the highest school of economics, that have been churning out Western-style technocrats and managers? They are the people who are going to compete against those ill-educated veterans. So we are going to see maybe some sparks in Russia, maybe some conflagration. I don't think it adds up to a real civil war. I don't think it adds up to the collapse of Russia. Many people think about it, but we may see a lot of very dramatic changes.
Let's move on to a similar, somewhat trajectory, similar country. You're looking at our other neighbor, Turkey. Mr. Erdogan clearly said at some point very early on that he's going to take the democracy train to where it takes him, and when it needs to, he'll get off. And it seems like he's getting off because if there were normal elections held and are likely to be held, he would actually lose to the person who's in jail and other people who he's likely to put in jail. In what way has he changed that society? I mean, to what extent is Kemalism broken? Has he finally slayed the dragon culturally? So what? Even if it comes after him, will look very much like him. Sort of like this, and I hate this phrase, but in this case, it might be accurate. Sort of some fusion of Islamism and fascism, however you want to describe it, and this talk of neo-Ottomanism, which to me is somewhat farcical, because you can't be neo-Ottoman with an Argentine type economy. How real is that? So let's start with the first one. Has he slayed Kemalism, and what's likely to come there?
Yes, but as always, yes, but Kemalism will come back in a different guise, because Mustafa Kemal Atatürk remains a very powerful icon, and icons have a tendency to be refashioned in different manner. Very much like I would predict that Lenin and maybe even Stalin, might come back. Stalin has been too much abused by Putin's regime, but there must be some kind of great leaders in the past. Your question about Turkey actually is the question about the whole world. Because the problem is that states in the 20th century have been justified, legitimated, justified. The existence was justified in terms of developmentalism. The state is what building roads, healthcare system, universities, sends men into space, maybe something like that. By the late 20th century, it became very difficult because, on the one hand, much has been done. This is the problem of European social democracy. 8-hour workday, hey, done. Paid vacation. My favorite title here, Studs Terkel's book, From the People Who Brought You Weekend. History of American labor unions. Labor unions. People ask yourself, when did your parents or grandparents begin having weekends? It was only in the 1960s, including here. So almost all over the world, huge demographic change is happening. Now, village started coming massively into the cities. They're not very welcome. They stay in what in Turkey is called gecekondu, these illegally suburbs, favelas of some kind, in
the outskirts of town.
Soviet Union actually did a relatively good job with that, so they built these drab, awful Bangladesh areas in Yerevan, so they built prefabricated houses, which people then rebuilt to their own liking, so they look like favelas actually, and they function pretty much like favelas. But notice, we have nowhere the same crime as in favelas, and Armenia is actually one interesting exception on this count. Villagers bring their religiosity and their anger into cities. So it's not that Erdogan broke Kemalism. It's the wave of these villagers.
It's the people he brought.
The people who brought Erdogan himself. So my favorite, and allow me a story, because we have, when I teach my students, I always stop after 15 minutes and say, and now story time, their favorite. I once supervised a postdoc from Turkey. Why a Turk? Because my American dean told me, Georgi, it looks like you're the only one who can pronounce his name. And I could, Gian was a brilliant young man, Gian Tual, asked my opinion about his theoretical chapter 1 in his projected book. It was 102 pages long, if I remember correctly. So it was about dialogism of Bakhtin and the theory of communicative action of Habermas. So I looked at him and said, Cihan Bey, as an Armenian, I'm not going to lie to a Turk. Throw it into your lowest, don't throw it away, but put it in the lowest drawer in your desk and return to it 20 years later. Who in the world is interested in what a Turkish graduate student thinks about Bakhtin or Habermas? 102 pages. When you become famous professor, you'll publish it. Chapter 2 becomes chapter 1 because it's brilliant. You did not find a job after graduating from very prestigious university in Istanbul. So you took a job courageously in one of these newly built areas of Istanbul called Sultanbeyli as a school teacher. You rent a room in an illegally built cinder block structure where ground floor is çaykhana, is in a tea house, tea shop. So this is where you have your meals. You meet the parents of the children. You're part of the community, and you describe this community so wonderfully. And this community votes for Erdogan. They're Erdoganists, they're massively, because they all came from somewhere in Eastern Anatolia. Why are they in Istanbul? They would prefer to go to Germany. Just those luckier ones had relatives in Germany. These are the people who didn't have relatives. They came here. They went into downtown Istanbul and they saw that these people drink and girls dressed like that. And of course, their own girls would no longer obey their parents if they do something like that. So the first thing they built is a small mosque. Why? Because mosque would be less likely to be demolished by police. And then the guy who organized building the mosque, whom everybody calls Mufti, nobody knows, is he a real Mufti or what? Everybody calls his Mufti. The Mufti opens a Shinanut, department store selling construction supplies. Everybody's buying from, so he's local entrepreneur. When the police comes, he negotiates with the police. When they need electricity and sewer in the newly built neighborhood, he goes to the mayor of Istanbul and explains to him, boss, recognize us as municipality and our votes, and you know who is the boss. That is how young Erdogan came to power. Cihan Tuval now is full professor at UC Berkeley. He published his chapter 1 and he's now one of the greatest authorities on Turkey. At some point, he told me, Georgi Bey, what you're telling me is actually pretty much like Brazil. I tell him, so my job is by reading and discussing. What you are showing me is this. These people in the 1920s would come to French cities and become communists. In Italy in the 1950s, they would become communists. Now they become Islamists. They're villagers. This flow of villagers is ending. Villages are almost empty. Western Armenia or Eastern Anatolia is almost empty now of the people. Nobody can live there. There are no jobs. There is no communication. And therefore, you see what's happening in places like Israel between the religious,
ultra-Orthodox,
all over the place. Armenia is to some extent in Russia. Who are the people supporting the war? Who are the people relocating to Armenia into Europe? So this conflict is there, and the new kind of regimes we see claim that they're not dictatorships. They're civilizations. Their favorite author is Samuel Huntington. We are the clash of civilization. You wanted clash of civilizations? Here we are. We are the Ottomans. We are Modi's India. We are Iran. We are Russia.
That's the same trade.
Yeah.
Let's move on to this will be the final country we're visiting, which is Iran, because there's some important critical things happen there. The 12-day war, the attack on Iran by Israel and the United States. The intentions were to smash the regime, to decapitate it, but in reality, those things didn't happen. In reality, what you probably did is that you smashed a post-current regime Iran from actually being pro-Western and far more likely to be militarist. We're far more likely to see a regime in which Islam gets less and less, it becomes less and less Islamic. At the same time, it becomes more and more nationalist, because Islamism has essentially failed in Iran, actually ahead of other places. Do you share my sentiments in what is to come, given the drama of the 12 days, which was a shock to that country and its society, which, by the way, did not lead to a single demonstration that anyone knows about against the regime, or at least a major one, and a very, very unpopular regime that probably in an election wouldn't get more than 20% of the vote, at least for the time being, managed to consolidate around nationalism. Where do you see them going?
Where do you see the whole world going? Because when you ask me about Erdogan, why not ask about Donald Trump? How long would that be? So we are inside a historical wave, which is very murky, huge historical wave, which we call populisms, right wing. I would say, that these are mostly, the former villages, or in America, former farmers. But the people who become white working class or whatever, the people who
or underclass,
who feel that if they could only get out all these foreigners from the country, if they could only, so if you can find, a doer as the leader, and that's why, such charismatic doers, but they're frankly they're doing such a bad job. that I do wonder, could it become counterproductive, right? After Putin, I do envision a big recoil in Russia in the opposite direction. After Erdogan, there could be a very serious recoil, because there are a lot of Turks, so just as you said, they're not necessarily Kemalists, but they are urban, educated, and Erdogan is losing in all the urban agglomerations in his native city, in Istanbul. So he has to put his opponents in prison, and prison, as we know, very often is the best way of creating political personality. Eventually, in Iran, it could be the same story. So Iran was ripening for secularization and a different, nationalist but social democratic regime of some kind. Justice must be there, but there must be developmentalism, because the previous regime has failed. If I were an Iranian, I would be patriotic Iranian because I'm proud, of course, of my great Iranian culture. But look what you have done to it. We are the descendants of the Achaemenids and the Sasanians, and you are just telling me, that our names should be Arabic. By the way, so you know better than I, how Iranians look at the faces of the Iranians when they come to Yerevan and realize that taxi driver is called Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes. So you have the real names, not us. You preserved Zohrab, yeah. Vardges, all over. So my position would be that, look at you guys, that you wrecked the country, promising that we would be strong, that we would dominate the Middle East, and we would have the nuclear bomb. We don't have the bomb, we are not dominating the Middle East, and we have this. So we paid all the price,
and got nothing in return.
And got nothing for it. So for the time being, the presence of Israel and Americans at the border, of course, is preventing political activity in Iran. Somebody will have to figure out the way of deconstructing the regime, and usually it is done from above. Somebody like Gorbachev, somebody surprising, usually figures which were always supposedly
this could
weak.
come after the passing of the supreme leader. Actually,
after the supreme leader, you would see so the struggle for another supreme leader. There could be another supreme leader, but he would never fill the shoes of this supreme leader, which means that there will be president.
Yeah.
Which means that there would be still the Revolutionary Guards, the Corps of Revolutionary Guard, but everybody would ask them, guys, what have you done? So, lost wars which fail to produce heroic generals are not conducive to very political results. They are conducive to bitterness.
Well, I'm going to close with this, but speaking of the Iranian supreme leader, that's having been in politics for more than 3 decades. It's like the most ideal political job in the world, in which you have all the power and none of the responsibility. It's actually an ingenious office. It's like being a medieval pope without the everyday trappings of running the country. Thank you for being with us, Georgi, joining us here.
Thank you for this opportunity.